Our conversation this hour is on biodiversity. Okay, big word, linguistic gymnastic things about to start happening. But all right, before we get into that, let us hear today's proverb from Djibouti.
Yes. Right. A wound inflicted by a friend does not heal. What do you think?
A friend can really hurt you deep because the bond you have with your friend, goes beyond the superficial. So it will not only hurt the body, but it will hurt the heart.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
Those deep words are coming from the voice of Olivia Adhiambo, who is a project officer, Civil Society Partnerships and Policy, WWF Kenya. Olivia, good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome to the Situation Room. I know I told you we are friends and we're having a conversation, but you're actually in the hot seat of the Situation Room. So Karibu, don't worry, warm things up for you just a little bit. And we're having a conversation this morning about the impact of biodiversity loss. Okay, let's just do a rewind.
Big word?
Yes. Like I said, linguistic gymnastics about to take place. Look, let's start from the beginning and say, okay, let's establish this somewhere.
Yeah.
What is biodiversity? Do we have it? Do we buy it in the shop? Then when we say loss, why don't we have it anymore?
Or do you grow it?
You grow this biodiversity somewhere?
What does a tree look like, or what does a plant look like?
Thank you for having me in the show. Let me just take a step back and let our audience know that this week on May 22nd, the world celebrated International Biodiversity Day. The theme of this year was From Agreement to Action, Building Back Better. So it is a big word. It is a global buzz. But in simple terms, biodiversity is the variety of plants and animals that we find in nature. And nature, we know that it is your surrounding. So this variety differs from place to place, depending on where you are. So you could be in a mountain region. The variety of plants and animals would be different from somebody who is in the asal areas of, say, Isiolo or Marsabit. And all of this variety plays an important role in how the earth stays in balance. So when you remove one aspect of this variety that I'm mentioning, then the earth's balance begins to tilt. Yeah, so that is biodiversity in simple terms. I hope I haven't spoken too scientifically.
And in simple terms, are you saying that an imbalance exists?
In simple terms, I'm saying an imbalance exists when we remove something from the balance.
All right, let me ask my question again.
Yes.
Are you then saying,
yes,
for you to have a conversation about biodiversity, it means the diversity and the balance that you expect is either under threat or it doesn't exist? Because if there was no imminent threat, what are we discussing?
Biodiversity is under imminent threat globally and in Kenya. And the causes of this threat are largely driven by our behaviors as humans. We have converted natural spaces into settlement, into agriculture, land, into infrastructure such as roads, airports, railways, and ports. And so through those activities, we have cut down trees, we have changed habitats where animals live in order for us to, quote unquote, modernize our lives. Our survival or our day-to-day consumption comes from the environment, from nature. So our food, our clothing comes from nature. But what we have done over the years is that we have overexploited our natural resources in order for us to meet our needs. And this again has led to the loss in biodiversity. And the third aspect of the threat to biodiversity is pollution. So after we have consumed, after we have used, we dump our waste carelessly back to the environment. We have plastics that are clogging our waterways and our river and lake systems. We have waste that is found literally everywhere we turn, in our cities, in our villages. And so that has led to the loss in biodiversity and in natural spaces.
Okay. You talked about something, and if we talk about development, the race towards industrialization that needs to happen for quite a number of nations today, inadvertently would affect the biodiversity index in a lot of these. So you're stuck in a catch-22, if you ask me. What do? Do you industrialize? Do you go towards modernity? Or do you say, okay, actually, you know what? Let us maintain these spaces. Let us maintain clean rivers. Let us maintain these open spaces where flora and fauna can thrive. Or is there a balance that can be struck between the two?
Yes, indeed. Biodiversity is not the enemy of development or of progress. The two can coexist. Development and nature can coexist with proper planning. I think in Kenya we have land use plans at national level and at county level that outline where and how we should use our land and our spaces. So we find that, for example, there are certain areas that we should demarcate for forests. There are certain lands that can be demarcated for agriculture and certain spaces that can be demarcated for settlement and other activities that relate to industrialization. But a lot of times these plans are really made but kept in the shelves. So in the race to develop or in the race to industrialize, we ignore these plans. We ignore that there are strategies in place that can actually allow us to coexist with nature. Secondly, with modern developments, we find that there are options of industrializing without affecting our natural systems. We have new energy sources that do not have to necessarily affect our environment. We have renewable energy sources from solar, from wind, from geothermal power that can power our industries and at the same time limit the waste that goes into our environment. There are infrastructural designs that are coming up that do accommodate natural spaces. Our roads can be built in a way that trees can also grow alongside the roads. Plants can also thrive alongside our railway lines and so on and so forth. So it's a matter of planning. It's a matter of having a paradigm shift in the way we know development and learning lessons from countries that have degraded their biodiversity at the expense in the name of development. So
what does it do? So we're talking about the impact of this loss on the environment, on countries, on nations. What is that impact? Because what is it? Okay, so a bunch of trees were cut down. So what, right? But we have a building that is standing in that place today. Okay, so rivers are dirty, we can clean them up, right? But it's a little bit more than that lackadaisical attitude, isn't it? What impact does this loss have on us today that perhaps we don't see right now?
Thank you for that question. I think that is now the heart of the matter. Our very existence depends on nature. The air that we breathe comes from nature. The water that we drink, I'm having a bottle of water beside me here, comes from a river catchment. The food that we eat comes from pollinators, the bees and the birds that help pollination to happen so that our fruits, our vegetables are produced. So if we continue to ignore this threat of biodiversity loss, then it means that our very existence is threatened, because once you do not have clean water to consume, then it means that we'll continue to experience disease outbreaks. We'll continue to have water shortages, yet life itself depends on water. Without proper clean air to breathe, we'll continue to have respiratory problems. Without food, who can exist without food?
Sure.
So biodiversity is really the thread that ties human existence. And so we cannot continue to ignore this problem. We cannot continue to think of it as a science problem, because a lot of this has been communicated in a science way. And I hope me being here helps to unpack the science into a very simple language, so that we're able to appreciate that if we do not take action now, our children and our children's children may not enjoy the simple pleasures we enjoy of a fruit, clean air, clean water.
Can I ask this question?
Yeah.
In this country, this lovely country of ours, Kenya, do we have legal frameworks? Do we have constitutional framework? Do we have the law that enables those who are in authority to ensure that what is desired is actually brought into being?
Yes, indeed, we do have laws. Our 2010 Constitution provides for the right to a clean and healthy environment. And that was a groundbreaking provision globally, because not many countries recognize environment at that level. We have laws that touch on biodiversity. For instance, we have Forest Conservation and Management Law. We have Environmental Management Coordination Act. We have Climate Change Act of 2016. So the laws are in place. Our government has made sure that the laws are in place. I think the challenge is, to what extent are we implementing these laws? To what extent are we going back to the rule of the law and say, this is what needs to be done, or this has been done, and these are the penalties that need to be taken into need to be implemented to ensure that our biodiversity is safeguarded. Yeah.
There's some very heartwarming, pleasing conversations that is had with regards to this country when we talk about renewable energy and how it is when we compare ourselves to the rest of the human beings who inhabit this planet. We are really way ahead. Okay, now, alongside that conversation, there's one about planting trees. You know, this one I'm asking because it confuses me.
Yeah.
See, how many trees do we actually need to plant so that we don't have a problem with pollution, greenhouse effect, and all the other things that climate change, warming, and all these other things that one keeps hearing about? Because it's clear to me that since I was taught photosynthesis in primary school, these plants and trees are supposed to help with this. And clearly, if there's a problem, then it means there aren't enough trees. Or does this problem go beyond trees?
Yes and no. So planting of trees is a big part of reversing biodiversity laws, and our president has committed to planting 15 billion trees.
He has,
in the next 5 years, and I think that's a very commendable commitment coming from the billion. Yes,
no, has nine zeros.
Billion trees.
Yes,
trees.
Yes, it's a very commendable commitment, because we need.
How many have we planted so far since he made that statement?
I do not have the statistics here with me, but I know that since the rain season began this year, there's been quite a lot of concerted efforts.
Let me do a little math
to restore our forest.
If we want to plant 15 billion trees, and we want
in
to
make
in
5 years,
then it means we need to be planting 3 billion trees every year.
Yes.
Is that not so?
And how many are we in Kenya currently? What is the population of Kenya?
Kenyans, I think we're around 50 million.
Yeah, close to 50 million.
So do that math against 50 million. How many people, how many trees every individual needs to plant per year?
You know, when you talk population, please remember some people don't even know trees exist because of their age.
And that is why you're having this conversation today. Why don't we start a campaign and encouraging each and every individual to plant at least 10 trees.
Super. I love what you're saying now. Tell me.
If every Kenyan would plant 10 or 20 trees a year, we definitely meet that target.
I am in complete agreement with you. But let me ask the question. The bulk of our population are young.
Yes.
What are the efforts we are making to ensure that part of the school-going process is one of planting trees?
a lot of our a big part of our population is young people, and that is a plus in this biodiversity discussion, because young people have not only the energy but the innovation to actually bring about the change that we need. In terms of tree planting, we can dedicate spaces in our schools and in our education institutions for tree growing. We can encourage children to plant trees during their birthdays. So instead of having cake, or alongside having cake for your birthday, why don't you buy 20 seedlings every year to just commemorate your birthday, and it will be there until you grow old, and your children and your children's children will be able to appreciate that you were able to plant this number of trees. But let me get back to the solution. So it's not all gloom and doom. I think sometimes when you hear about these threats and what it means for the future generations, a lot of us cring and think that the world is coming to an end. I would like to say that it is not all gloom and doom. There is a lot that we can do at individual level to ensure that we are contributing to reversing these losses, and one of the actions is awareness creation. And this talk show, I must commend you for bringing me here to let the public know that there is a threat, but also there is something we can do about it. There have been a lot of awareness around schools, a lot of programs to educate young people and to train children up at a young age to know the importance of the environment, but also looking at our individual patterns of production and consumption. Do we need all the food that we buy? And once we buy it, how do we manage the waste that is generated from this food? Are we able to recycle? Are we able to reuse? Are we able to avoid? For instance, plastics is a huge menace. Are we able to avoid using plastic that is a menace to our water systems? Are we able to limit our consumption to the extent to which we only consume what we need, rather than just a wasteful consumption? Yeah.
It seems to me that even as you speak of these things, that there has to be the effort needs to be concerted.
Yes.
Because these things that you talk about, advocacy for these things, have to take on the nature of a campaign. Yes. And they have to be continuous in nature. You cannot start talking about biodiversity loss and its impact on the nation and the environment and stop at some point. It has to be continuous flows of information. It has to be from the very youngest to the very oldest. There are people who live on the edge of dump sites. There are people who then continue adding waste to that dump site, not for anything, but for want of a proper place to dispose of their garbage. So are these messages running through and through, from the highest echelons of those who can do something about it to the user at the very bottom of the totem pole? So here are we talking about cleaning our rivers. Here we're talking about planting trees, 10 of you to plant trees. And is there then a split mind here when it comes to looking for what you will eat on a daily basis or conserving the environment? And that's why I think that unfortunately there's a competition for attention in terms of priorities. That how will you be able to convince that woman or that man who is looking for food that, where you live and where you're dumping your garbage is not really helping us right now, and this woman is not listening to you, because they're thinking, okay, that's great, but you know what, I have to eat today. And so I think that's what puts us in a precarious situation, because too much in terms of percentage of our population is grappling with survival at the very basic level and is not able to offer any more in terms of their mind towards some of the things we're talking about. I think that is where a challenge is. And then the question is, how do we deal with that challenge?
Yeah, you've rightly stated that there are a lot of competing needs, but unfortunately this is one issue that we cannot delegate. As I've mentioned earlier, this biodiversity loss threatens our very existence. So instead of looking at it as a problem to solve after I have met my basic needs, we need to think of it as a problem that I need to solve as I meet my basic needs. Because with that, as we continue to ignore it, we are continuing to threaten our children and our children's existence. So my take on this is that let us have every hands on deck. I mean, Kenya is one of the countries that is always ahead in terms of taking action on these kinds of threats. Let us have our leaders talking to their constituents. Let us have influencers out there talking about climate change, talking about biodiversity loss and what needs to be done. Let us have social media buzzes going on and on about what needs to be done, because this is one issue that every hand has to be on deck for us to come up with lasting solutions. Yeah.
You know, for what you're saying to make sense, one has to large picture perspective, looking into the future. Everything we're talking about needs to be inculcated in young school-going children. If children learn this from a very early age, they'll grow up understanding it.
Definitely.
These jaded adults who have other interests and whose focus is completely different. Because you look at a tree, you're seeing charcoal. Yes, you look at a tree, you're thinking
Timber.
building. Yes, exactly. Okay. You need, in the absence of a focused and deliberate attention on ensuring that school-going children from the earliest age are taught this process and the importance of it, then we've lost that battle.
That is very true. I think young people hold the biggest hope for me. We have seen a number of innovations in different sectors that have been driven by young people. We have seen campaigns like Fridays for Future is one of the campaigns that I really follow closely, where young people are standing up and saying, you know, even school is not important if we do not address climate change. We have seen a lot of renewed energy from young people calling out leaders during international and global meetings and saying, you know, enough talk, let us move to the action. So I think our education system needs to be alive to these threats and to these biodiversity threats that we are talking about, and our education system needs to take into consideration that we need to educate and equip our young people to address threats that we may not even understand the extent of it. I mean, today we are talking about the lion population in Kenya being at 2,500. Can you imagine? We have come to a level where our lion population is at 2,500 in Kenya. So if we continue with this kind of trajectory, it means that in the next 2 or 3 generations, there might not be lions to see. We might only see them in museums or in photos. So young people are the most at risk in terms of the threats, but they also offer the biggest hope for addressing biodiversity threats.
So sometimes if we hear that what will happen again and again, it then now, pushes folks to do something about the situation.
Yes, indeed. I think what the scenario that we are looking at, if we continue with inaction, number one is we are losing species. I've talked about the population of lions in Kenya standing at about 2,500. Who would want their grandchildren to ask them what it felt like to have lions, and not being able to your great-grandchildren not being able to see those lions for themselves? I've talked about bees being very key in our food systems. Bees are under threat because of the chemicals we use in our farms. So if we continue with business as usual, we won't have the pollination function taking place, which means that our food chain will continue to decrease, or the food that you're able to access will continue to decrease. Biodiversity provides other services that we enjoy, such as water. As we continue to diminish our water towers, because our water towers form part of the biodiversity, it means the water available for our use will continue to diminish, and this will lead to other threats such as human and wildlife conflict. Kenya has just come from a very severe drought, and we know that with severe drought, it means that there's limited pasture, there's limited water that is available for both human and wildlife, and this is where human-wildlife conflict starts to manifest, because wildlife starts to move into human spaces to be able to access food, to be able to access water, and the conflict emerges from there. So with a business as usual approach or mentality, it means that we will lose species whose value we probably do not fully know right now, because a lot of the species we are losing, we fully have not done the extensive research to know what other values they have, and they also have an existential value. We'll continue to see a change in our surroundings in terms of the aesthetic nature, aesthetic value of our surrounding. The food and water provisioning services will continue to diminish, leading to conflict. So we do not want to go down that road. I think this is a point of wake up and a point of clarity for all of us, so that we are able to take action before we get to that scenario. Yeah.
You know, whenever one talks about the environment, now you introduce a term like biodiversity.
Yes.
Essentially, you're now talking about how all living creatures interact.
Yes.
Because not just plant or trees, it's the animals who share this space with us, ourselves.
Exactly.
These microorganisms, insects, all these things. Now, yes, there's always the threat, but the biggest threat is argued to be the human being. Yes. However, in a country like ours, a country that claims it has wonderful laws, a beautiful constitution that's supposed to take care of all these things, and yet it doesn't take place. So the biggest threat to biodiversity therefore becomes the government, because there's even a ministry that is supposed to be in charge of things like environment and aspects of the environment. So everything that works around and is part of the environment, there is a structure that is supposed to look after it. You see, when people talk about drought and people talk about an absence of water, and then we know there exists huge reservoirs of aquifers in the country, and you are told that the problem may be it's too much salinity, and yet we also know that modern technology has brought to our attention and knowledge desalination plants that use solar. And in some of the areas that we have these problems, there's more solar than you know what to do with. And yet you don't hear a conversation about how it is that what is available, this resource can be tapped so that it actually serves the purpose for which it was intended. So when I say it is government, it is not that I'm attempting to be facetious. I'm pointing to where the problem is, because when you talk about a situation where the fundamental interest, and you touched on it, is how to survive the day. Who can change that perspective? Because the individual is doing what they can within their means and is keeping alive and staying alive. But to go beyond that, essentially we're saying it is beyond the individual. So how then do we make this conversation something that stops being a conversation and becomes part of our reality? Because, you know, this conversation we had about trees, it's good because trees are things we live with and we understand. If you do the maths of the 50 billion trees and you look at the landmass of this country, if they're all planted, it means it would occupy 85% bless you, of our landmass. But what it also means is that we need to be planting 2 million trees every day. Now you tell me, good conversation, 50 billion. 2 million trees every day, tell me.
Let me take you back to your initial statement about humans being the biggest threat.
Yes.
Let me start from there. And yes, indeed, as humans, our activities or our actions is what is really accelerating biodiversity loss. And I think I've alluded to some of the actions. We have converted natural habitats for settlement and for agriculture and infrastructure. We are polluting the environment without any sort of care or alarm. We are overexploiting natural resources, unsustainably overexploiting natural resources. We might continue pointing the finger in different directions, whether we want to blame it on the government, whether we want to develop to blame it on developed countries. But I think we also have to look at what individual actions are we taking. The government will not come to your house to tell you to disaggregate your waste and remove the plastics for recycling and use the organic waste to make manure. I think that there are some actions that boil down to individual responsibility, individual awareness, and I am hoping that this is one of the avenues that the public can know that we cannot continue to shift this blame to the government or to other entities, but it's time that we take individual responsibility. The ambition of the 15 billion trees, yes, it is ambitious, but I believe that if we aim for the stars, we will land in the moon. If we continue to make ambitious commitments, then this ambition will rub onto everyone, and everyone will have the individual responsibility to take up this ambition. I, for instance, am very much committed to planting trees around where I live, around my surrounding, just to ensure that I am meeting that commitment. And I hope everyone listening to this show will be committed to plant at least a tree, 2 trees, 5 trees, 10 trees, just to ensure that your surrounding is as close to nature as possible. But it's not just about tree planting, it's about also natural regeneration. I know it sounds like a really big word, and I'll try to break it down.
What's that?
But there are spaces that spaces that do not necessarily need trees, but need to be left alone to regenerate.
Okay.
For the indigenous plants that existed to grow on their own. So it's this biodiversity, reversing biodiversity loss. I want to emphasize it's not just tree planting. We also have to talk about regeneration, particularly in grasslands. We have to leave them to just grow naturally back to the grasslands or whatever vegetation that existed to regenerate and to grow on its own. It's about planning. I've talked about land use plans, the national land use plan that is in place. But within the land that you have bought, how effectively are you planning to ensure that there is space for nature? Now, if you have an acre, if you have 5 acres somewhere, how are you ensuring that a percentage of this land that I have is actually left for nature to coexist with whatever other activities I am doing? So yes, my rallying call today is not just to point the fingers, but also to look at individual responsibility. Absolutely. And not to look at biodiversity as a faraway need, but to look at it as a need that, if not met, will lead to our own detriment
and destruction. What role do governments play? If we look at so many things happening here, the climate action conversation, climate change conversation, we have now there's a summit that will actually be hosted in Nairobi in the coming months, weeks, right?
Yeah.
Governments are and then represented through organizations, are pulled into this conversation. Hopefully that they are leading the pack when it comes to these conversations and what should happen. Apart from having meetings in swanky hotels and resorts, what role do governments play in making sure that the loss of biodiversity is reduced, that climate action is actually an action, and that activities are taking place? Because for me, I look at it as an all-encompassing thing. That means that your ministries of education, environment, all of these are working in tandem to reach this goal. But what would you see as goals or activities that governments then must be involved in if this thing is going to be actually taken seriously?
Yeah, I mean, the first and the biggest role of the government is to play a facilitative role, and facilitative in different aspects, to facilitate, first of all, the creation of the knowledge. So equipping our scientists to be able to do the research and to produce the findings, to facilitate our education systems to integrate this knowledge into our schools, into our universities, into our colleges. To facilitate our agriculture systems to be able to take into account what actions that need to be taken. Right now, there are conversations around climate smart agriculture, and the government's role is to facilitate and ensure that the environment for climate smart agriculture is conducive. People are aware on what they need to do to implement climate smart agriculture. So for me, I would largely say it's a facilitative role to put in place the policies, to put in place the institutions that actually drive this process, and also to inspire the public, such as with the 15 billion tree campaign, to inspire the public to take action in what it needs to be done. Yeah.
Do you think there's enough of an understanding across board about this? I mean, we could have technocrats in certain parts who have it's understood this is what needs to be done. Yeah. But is there an understanding and accommodation across board, again, like these, the departments, the ministries, organizations, individuals? Is there enough of an understanding across board as per, number one, what the problem is, what the action ought to be, and what the future holds depending on what decision you take?
I think no. I think biodiversity has been communicated very scientifically, and so it has always been looked at as a scientific problem, and so it has scientific solutions. If you ask me what biodiversity is in my local language, I would really struggle. And I think we need to get to a point where we talk about it in our vernacular language, in Swahili, in Luo, in Kikuyu, in Kisi, so that my grandmother back in the village can actually relate to what I'm saying, so that every individual, educated or uneducated, can actually have a point of relation and contact, because it has trickled down to that level. So I think we need to unpack it from that scientific level that it is currently, to take it down to the ground. And also to look at what local knowledge has to offer. And I think the solutions don't lie in the science only. I think the role of indigenous knowledge has been downplayed in the solutions, but our grandmothers had the solutions on so many of the issues we are grappling with right now. So I think we need to take the conversation to the village level, to the local level, so that the interaction and the solutions can be very organic.
Sure.
Yeah.
Even as looking at where let's take Kenya as an example. Do you think it is possible, with the right conversations being had at the different levels at which they ought to be had, with the inclusion and activity of governments, with the understanding at an individual and community level, do you think Kenya can actually claw back on the losses that have been made and get to a place where biodiversity thriving, climate thriving, and as a result of that, communities and societies are thriving?
Yes, indeed. I mean, Kenya has been an early adapter in many innovations globally, and I don't think this challenge will be any different. I think what needs to be done is just to ramp up the energy and the call for action for people to begin to take up the challenge. I think we are at a point where we are seeing the effects. We are seeing the effects of climate change. We are seeing drought, and we're even seeing it from our neighbors. I mean, tropical cyclone Freddy that hit Malawi is a wake-up call for Kenya that, just because you're in an African country, you can't be hit by a tropical cyclone. So I think the message is already out there that we need to do something. And I think I have a lot of optimism that Kenya will be an early adapter in terms of reversing the losses of biodiversity. Yeah.
And how will this all play out, Marion, finally? How will this all play out? Still, again, in the race towards industrialization, in the race towards manufacturing, in the race towards these things that will then be the marks of a developed nation.
I think we have a lot of lessons to learn from developed nations that degraded their biodiversity. So if we're able to learn from the mistakes that were done by developed countries, we can make it right. And to some extent, we are learning in the energy sector. We are learning quite a lot because Kenya depends on renewable sources of energy. And if continue in that direction, then we'll be able to some extent have jumped one hurdle of relying on coal and fossil fuels to power our industries. There's a lot of innovations that have come up over the years that prove that development and biodiversity can coexist. We have seen in countries such as Singapore where superhighways are completely green. We have seen green buildings coming up where the 90% of the energy that is powering a building comes from solar and wind energy. So we are at a really unique point where innovation can support us to develop and not at the expense of biodiversity.
Okay. Well, I mean, the thing is that this, like we said, is the conversation that cannot stop because it's a continuous place where, if we don't keep the conversation alive, we run the risk of forgetting what ought to be done at any one level at any one time, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure.
Loss of biodiversity is a conversation that we have been having this morning. It is clear that there's so much that needs to happen when it comes to conversations just around our environment and what is important for us to survive. Our guest hour has been Olivia Adhiambo, who is the Project Officer, Civil Society, Partnerships and Policy, WWF Kenya. It's been great having the conversation with you today. And I think it's also important that we're still having experts younger in age who are having these conversations, with us today. So it's not just for people who've, been around the block.
Yeah, and isn't that inspiring to see young people coming up and standing up and saying, I want to be counted in the discussion, in the solutions, in the rooms where solutions are generated.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much for having me.